I'm Jim Check with Now Media. With me, Dan Albas, our local MP here for, Kelowna West, South Okanagan. Did I get that right?
Okanagan Lake West, South Kelowna, but very
Okanagan
close.
West. Yeah, Ian threw me off when he kind of tried to play games with it there. And also with us, Ian Burns, our managing editor, all the way out there in the nation's capital. I believe you're here at home right now. Are you not, Dan?
I'm happy to be in beautiful BC.
There you go. Lots going on with this BC Ferries, and I mean, to me, it's starting to look like a scandal. Lots of stuff going on with it, though. And then today, they just released the information that $1 billion of taxpayer funds are going towards it as well. Well, a loan from the infrastructure bank.
Yes. So when the Liberals created the Canadian Infrastructure Bank in 2017, they actually touted at the time that this would actually draw foreign investment to help build infrastructure here in Canada. And now, fast forward to today, where are we at? We have a infrastructure bank that seems to be more about outsourcing Canadian jobs at the expense of Canadian taxpayers. So the acronym CIB, I thought originally was the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, but it seems to me now it's the Chinese Infrastructure Bank.
Yeah, because I mean, if we listen to the podium talk there, we talk about we need to use Canadian steel, we need to use Canadian aluminum, we need Canadian jobs, and that's echoed in the BC NDP as well. And here it is, a big job, $1 billion plus, and we send the jobs overseas. We use Chinese steel, we use Chinese aluminum, and then they also have tariffs on our canola and other products here in Canada at the same time. And then plus they're also accused of a lot of human rights violations for their workers.
Yeah, so both Mark Carney and David Eby, when they were running in their respective election, both of them said elbows up. Both of them said that Canada's strong. We'll build it in BC. We'll do it here in Canada, and basically rallied against the unjustified and still are unjustified American steel and aluminum tariffs. But at a time right now where our aluminum and steel workers, in many cases, some of them are laid off and are seeking EI. Right now, they're shocked to find out that their government is actually supporting the outsourcing of it through their own tax dollars. So it's a betrayal. It is a sign to me that this government, federally and provincially, are part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. China has, as you said, human rights concerns, but let's also be frank, the industrial carbon tax does not exist for the steel and aluminum. In fact, the Chinese government subsidizes it. So there's a lot to unpack here, but essentially, right now we have politicians who are in charge of these things, and they're writing checks not to Canadians, but to a state-owned enterprise in China. And I think it's shameful. And I think that the fact that we had to find out in the Globe and Mail about our own tax dollars shows that there's some real problems with accountability and transparency in this government.
So the question is Chrystia Freeland wrote that letter to the Premier, which we finally got to see that letter, and it says you better not be using any federal money in there. And then EB's response was, mind your own business, that we don't use any money. Let's talk about out east. But turns out there is the infrastructure money that's in there. And so EB either didn't know that they got the $1 billion loan, and Freeland didn't know that they lent it to him.
So look, this you either can attribute to malice or incompetence. The fact that we have two leading politicians in Canada, both unaware of what the government, their respective governments, are doing to outsource Canadian jobs, is atrocious. This is why conservatives were not just pointing fingers at the government. We actually want to have some transparency and some accountability. That's why I've been caucusing this whole morning with my conservative members that are on the Transportation, Infrastructure, and Communities Committee, because that is a federal public forum where members of parliament can ask tough questions. And the fact that we just found out these details today is shameful. It's shameful that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank only revealed this to the Globe and Mail in response to a question and wasn't outright transparent. This is not a transparent government. This is a government that says one thing, Canada strong, and then does another and does wrong to Canada.
the unions have responded as well, saying, how are we supposed to compete when they can get cheaper wages, and then they get, like you just said, on the steel and aluminum, how are we supposed to compete when they get subsidized steel and aluminum, no carbon tax? And then the bigger thing for the unions is that the wages are a lot cheaper there because there's actually violations, and they're using cheap labor, and sometimes, like there's even allegations of rights violations. Or how is Canadian unions or jobs supposed to compete with that?
Well, that's the whole point. In fact, the whole last election was about Pierre Poilievre saying that we need to do a bring it home tax cut so that we can bring home investment into Canada and see our producers thrive and compete. It was the Harper government that actually instituted the National Shipbuilding Program that has now made it so that the Canadian shipbuilders can get back in the game. But you're 100% right. China does not follow the standards that we have here, and there's also other concerns that Chrystia Freeland raised in her tut-tut letter to Minister Farnworth, where she said there's concerns around national security. So BC Ferries is saying one thing, that they're working with Public Safety Canada, that they're working with Transport Canada to make sure that these ships are all above board, literally. But yet we have these tut-tut letters and inconsistencies with both the federal and provincial government. I got to tell you guys, I've never seen so much incompetence and so many pointing fingers. If we're going to be Canada strong, if we are going to come together as a country and say, let's do it in Canada, then let's actually do that instead of these side deals of billions of dollars where we see taxpayers funding both operation and capital of the outsourcing of their jobs. Shameful.
Has this question been put to Mark Carney yet? Because Ian and I both have not seen it, have not seen a reporter put this question directly to Mark Carney on the Canadian steel, the aluminum, and that $1 billion plus contract that was sent to China, especially when Scott Moe has been complaining about what the tariffs are doing to the farming industry in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, at one of the press conferences that he had while he's in Europe, Mark Carney actually said that the trade component and the military component was about finding like-minded allies and to try to do work together. I'm sorry, you can't get much further than writing a $1 billion check to someone. And let's be mindful, Mark Carney actually said that that China presents the biggest national security challenge to Canada. So you can't square these circles. And this is where, again, the Transport Committee has a useful function. We will require help from either a bloc member or from the Liberals in order to be able to see this study go forward. That's one of the reasons why we're sounding this alarm, that we have inconsistent statements, both from the elections, but also contradictory statements from the provincial government to the federal and from the federal to the provincial. We need to figure out what is going on, and we also do need to hear from stakeholders. I'm very keen to find out and hear from people that work in steel, aluminum, and shipbuilding as to what their thoughts are on this.
Ian?
Yeah. So is it your opinion, Dan? Can I just get you to clarify? Is it your opinion that Freeland did not know when she said that in Parliament, that she didn't actually know about this arrangement?
Well, we just don't know that because she was saying that she was concerned, like we were, that BC was purchasing ferries from a Chinese state-owned enterprise. But when she said that I asked her on the House floor, would she guarantee that not a single cent of federal transfers would be allowed to go towards this capital investment? She said that she had written a letter asking for that assurance. Now we find out that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is already, I think it was March 24th, had signed a deal with BC Ferries. March 24th. And we only find out today in June, and only because a reporter thought to ask. So the fact that we have these big checks being written on behalf of the Canadian taxpayer from an organization that was supposed to be about building infrastructure in Canada is now helping Chinese jobs and growing their economy. That's a huge issue.
And it also, as well, I mean, something I find quite remarkable about this is that Chrystia Freeland hasn't commented in 2 days now since the Globe first asked for her opinion on this, her comment on this, and again she hasn't today. And it's Gregor Robertson, isn't it? The housing, because his portfolio includes this bank, I believe, and his comment, it's fairly sort of generic and predictable. But I find like that's a little bit unusual, isn't it? For the two cabinet ministers are kind of, there's a distance between them. They both have a little bit of responsibility for this story, but whose responsibility is it? I mean, since you're the expert, is it Freeland or is it Robertson?
Well, again, the fact that Minister Robertson only asked for a briefing or for a meeting from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank today when he was asked by reporters, I don't think either of them knew about this. And that just raises all sorts of alarm bells. The agreement was clearly signed, we know now through the media, March 24th. But yet we don't know until today. And the minister seemed to show shock and asked for a briefing. So to me, I'm leaning more towards incompetence than malice. But this is where we do need to ask these tough questions. And I will tell you, Minister Freeland and Minister Robertson have been entrusted with huge responsibility and huge authority. And now they have to exercise both, because right now it seems to the average taxpayer who's sending their checks to Ottawa, that now finds out that they're funding jobs somewhere else. These are, it's shocking to me that we're even in this stage.
What responsibility does David Eby have when he said that he wasn't getting the money from the government, and then it turns out that there's $1 billion? He must have known. I mean, at some point they were looking through the budget and they had to figure out a way to pay for it. So they must have known, he must have known that that $1 billion was coming from the federal government.
I don't know that he did. I think that would be a great question for someone in the Parliamentary Press Gallery in Victoria or for an opposition MLA to ask. I'm asking these questions in Ottawa because I believe in accountability, and there's too many big questions here. Again, I don't want to have where we have a Canadian infrastructure bank that is now, in effect, operating and growing the economy in another country. Like, let's be mindful that this is the same government, or I should say the previous Liberal government under Trudeau, bought, shares in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And that funded, through Canadian tax dollars, investments in Asia, not in Canada. So we've long had concerns about how the government has been utilizing these so-called arm's length corporations to forward geopolitical goals. Look, I'm not going to go into a rabbit hole about who knew what or where, but we need to have some clarity, and we need someone to actually say, yes, the buck stops here. I'm in charge.
Yeah, one of the things that the Liberals have promoted was one economy, not 13. And I guess I haven't seen a response from Scott Moe on this yet either. But yeah, I would say that would probably not sit very well with Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, with what's going on with their canola crops and the tariffs that are put on them. And meanwhile, British Columbia is sending $1 billion plus overseas to China, and doesn't sound like one economy to me.
Well, and this just raises, again, my common sense motion at the committee. My first act as transportation critic when the committee was founded was to immediately call for there to be a condition set on transfers to provinces, that there should be a Made in Canada clause. Look, these are important, and I realize that people are counting on these infrastructure investments, but people are counting on these investments to be done wisely with their money. And so far, it just seems like we've gone from elbows up, do it in Canada, to somehow do it in China. And yet these politicians expect us to do it without asking the question, what? Anyway, this is why I'm the critic. This is why we have a committee. And so I look forward to Minister Freeland answering these important questions. And I'm sure my colleague, Leslyn Lewis, who is the critic for the infrastructure portfolio, will be asking Minister Robertson those questions as well. So I hope that he is briefed for that.
Yeah.
If you'd won the election, sorry, Jim. If you'd won the election 2 months ago, and you were now in Chrystia Freeland's job, and Leslyn Lewis was in Robertson's job, what would you do? What would the government's response be? How could you change this situation?
Well, we actually campaigned on getting rid of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank altogether. This is a crown corporation that has never delivered anything but bonuses for its own executives. They have a very poor track record for building for attracting foreign capital. I don't think they've attracted any. If so, it's very negligible, and they have failed to deliver on their promises. Let's be mindful, when this was first created, the Liberal government of the day took $35 billion from municipalities, money that was supposed to go over 5 years to municipalities, and reallocated to this Canadian Infrastructure Bank, saying that they would build projects that could be used to help municipalities. And so when I look at my former riding of Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola, when we talked about infrastructure, we see Merritt and Princeton both hit very hard by the flooding events of a few years ago, and yet they have not received infrastructure funding in order for them to protect their own communities. So this is the real disconnect that I see in Ottawa every day, where they say that they create these entities and they say that it's about Canadian jobs and building infrastructure in Canada, and yet we have this kind of response. It again, guys. Look, I try to be a very balanced MP, but I find it shocking that this government would say one thing and then do another in this quick. It's literally, some of us in Ottawa should get checked for whiplash.
Yeah, and I think with
Do
that
you think
employment,
Carney?
no, you go ahead.
Sorry again. This quick follow up. It's just, do you think Carney actually has the power now, either formally or informally, to change the situation, to cancel this contract?
Well, that's really a good question for the minister. I would firmly ask that question of both the minister and prime minister if I had the opportunity. But this is a case where we're not in session. That's why I've been asking for this emergency meeting of the transport committee. We can't allow these things just to slide idly by. If the financing is going to change, and by the way, is it not shocking to either of you? You would imagine that the Chinese would be able to fund their own ships and offer terms. To me, it seems absolutely crazy that we're actually subsidizing those jobs in China at non-market rates. They are getting a discount, and I just don't see why we would be incentivizing provincial governments to ship or offshore those jobs when we can be developing those jobs at home or with like-minded allies that we share more in common.
Yeah, with the unemployment rate projected to go over 7% here in Canada, you would think that those jobs would be also important, especially when the unions raised the points that it's almost impossible to compete with Chinese labor because obviously they pay them a lot less and have all those human rights violations. And so how is Canada supposed to compete? And then we're using federal tax dollars to actually support Chinese and actually a state-owned Chinese shipbuilder as well.
Yeah, well, again, unions tell me all the time that they, first of all, do it right. They utilize the right kind of steel. I know that there's some issues that the province is having with some of the Chinese steel that it's used on a bridge. I think the Patillo Bridge is the name of it. And so there's that. But then there's also the fact that unions that work on these ships bring in apprenticeships. And so the Harper government, when it created the Economic Action Plan, when it created the National Shipbuilding Program, those apprenticeships were all part of it. So the fact that we're 10 years into two versions of the Liberal Party and none of them have thought to add any conditionality just shows that we do have a lot of work to do in Ottawa, and it should not be. Again, I want to be part of the solution, so I'll work with anyone on the Transport Committee that wants to see these questions get asked and to get us onto a more common sense footing, because all of us benefit when we have those apprenticeships. And it's not just in C-SPAN, for example. It's also Irving shipyards. It's also Davie shipyards. So there's a lot that we can do. And the fact that no one has thought to apply some of the same thinking to these new ships shows that they're just not thinking, or they just don't care.
Yeah, one of EB's responses was that it's cheaper there. Obviously, it's cheaper there, right? But is that what we want to do at this point? especially with the rising unemployment in Canada?
Well, again, this is one of those cases where I don't understand how an NDP premier can look his NDP supporters in the eye and say we can do it cheaper in China. But that's really up for Mr. Eby to account for to his own political party supporters. But I will say that the Conservative Party wants to see support for our steel and aluminum workers. We want to see more work and more investment happening in this space. Let's not forget that Mark Carney, besides talking big about Canada strong and elbows up, he also actually said we want to spend less and invest more. It's just I wish that they were not spending less in Canadian apprenticeships, but investing more in Canadian shipbuilding and those associated industries.
So as Ian said, what's the next steps? You're gonna ask for a meeting, and then what are the next steps that you guys will be taking, the Conservatives?
Well, so we're negotiating with some of the other members. We want to make sure that the letter is worded in such a way that we can build support, because I can write a letter and have it received by the chair, and then we can have a meeting. But then if everyone just says nope, we don't support it, it's gavels down. That's not productive. So this is where I am appealing to other members of the committee, both Liberal and Bloc, to support a study. I think at very least, for myself, again, I still have to speak to other members. The Minister of Transport, the Honourable Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure, Communities, Gregor Robertson, as BC-based MP, and I'm also hoping for the President of the CEO of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, and that's for starters. But I'd also like to hear about from other members of the committee if they think that it needs to go farther than that. But that's a good starting point for me.
The Conservatives have more power in committee this time around with the NDP not having official party status. So you just have to kind of get the Bloc to work with you. Can you kind of just lay that out for Canadians, how that works this time around as opposed to the previous government?
Well, before, when you had 4 different parties, so you effectively had the NDP and the Bloc being the balance of power. So if either of those parties went with the Liberals would have an effective majority on the committee. And so this is where we saw things like the Green Slush Fund or other scandals that came up where if the NDP supported them, we just would stop the investigation there. Now, there's other tools that are available in our toolbox, but quite honestly, gentlemen, I'm very sure that we can. Again, this is the art of politics, is getting people to say yes. So I'm hopeful we can get at least one other member of the committee, because I do know that people we worked on that committee, and it seems to be a good group of people. But I'm going to give them the ability to give me their input, because like I said, I don't want to just write a letter for the sake of writing a letter. I want to write a letter so I can make Canada better.
Any last thoughts, Ian?
Yeah, I'll just give you one quick one and a nice, easy yes or no. Is it your position and the Conservative Party's position that this contract should be cancelled?
I think the minister needs to come to committee and talk about these things. But look, my party is fully opposed to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, and so we actually promised we would simply repeal the legislation and find other ways to invest in Canada, and that's the position of my party.
Do
But
you
not
want to
necessarily cancel this contract. Is that because it might upset the Chinese? Because there's a diplomatic element to this, isn't there?
Well, look, I'm just concentrating on the economic benefits and about supporting Canada. That's where I think this ultimately is. Both governments, federally and provincially, have thought that it's better in their interest to see this outsourcing of jobs go to China. And Conservatives are opposed to that. We actually want to change government policies so that we're not in situations like this. So that the fact of the matter is, we would much rather see these conversations start with Canada. And if some things, because perhaps there's an argument to be made that everything should be done in Canada, perhaps there's an argument to be made that there are some special equipment that we can outsource and save the taxpayer money. I'm not opposed to those things. But when we're actually talking about funding a country that Mark Carney, our Prime Minister, has said the greatest threat to Canada's national security is China, then I take a step back and say, maybe the government should too.
And my last question, I think Ian can help me with this. Canada used to be some of the biggest shipbuilders in the world. I think in the Second World War, we had the second largest navy. I don't know. Where were we at
I think
there?
it was third after the British and Americans. Yeah.
And obviously, we're not at that point anymore. And if we're sending our shipbuilding overseas, that doesn't really bode well for the industry as a whole.
Yeah, when I originally met with C-SPAN to talk about the National Shipbuilding Program, they told me that they used to do 80% of their work was on maintaining ships and 20% of it was on constructing. And now after the National Shipbuilding Program had been implemented, it's now reversed. So these things are tough, they take time, but they also need consistent policy. And that's where we need to look at these transfers that we give, whether they be the operating transfer under Chrystia Freeland of $38 million a year, or if we look at this Canadian Infrastructure Bank under Minister Robertson, these don't seem to be working towards those ends. And again, at a time where we see unemployment rising and we see the tariffs hurting our producers, this is the perfect opportunity to have a rethink.
Anything else, anybody? There you
And
go,
just say
Dan.
thank you for your time, Dan.
Yeah. Thank
Nope,
you.
appreciate it, guys. It's this is one that I'm sure I'm going to be hearing at the doors during my summer listening tour.
Thank you again, Dan. And we do thank you for watching Now Media.
Cheers.
Just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent.